Celtic lore, we are the unopened bud. We are the blossoms and the life force gathering into a crest. We are the still companions of silence and the far-flung seekers of the quest. We are the children of wisdom and the siblings whose questions never cease. We are the dawn light, searching out glad justice, and the center where all souls find peace. Together we are all of those things and so much more. And so we gather this morning to begin to name some of the ways that we show up for each other, for our communities, for the whole wide world, striving to be as creative and open-minded as we can be. Because ultimately, we want to help to make the world a place where every bud opens into a blossom. So let's remain seated now as we recite together our covenant, which is printed in the order of service. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. At the core of our worship, we share our joys and concerns so that we may bear witness to one another's lives.
There's something about the words and actions of people right before their deaths. Of course, we never know that they're going to die, and yet after they die, this is me, but I'm sure this is a pretty universal thing. People come together and just, oh right, this is what she said. Oh right, this is what he did. That jewel of the end of life. So I was on the schedule for today before SJ died. I was going to be talking about giving money in her name while she was alive. And because that mattered to me that she knew about this, and I always feel sad when people don't know. And yet what I'm going to say today, it's like, SJ, still you died too soon because you're not going to hear this. This is just, I guess, what happens. So SJ passed on a Wednesday night to Thursday, and some of you remember that several of us were in an anti-racism meeting on Zoom on the Monday night before she died. She came on late and she interrupted the meeting. No, she wasn't going to stay, but she had this important article to share about Taylor Ellis, who's very active in our community, going all around Rhode Island trying to obtain access to the shore from all different points. And did anyone want to read it? Yes, I want to read it. I don't get the paper. She's a paper reading. This is, right, 2 days before she died. And she, so it's like, all right, I'll get it to you. And so I see, and there's also nothing like seeing someone's handwriting, just how that feels. So in red, for Adria, saved. It says saved. 2 arrows pointing down into the article. So that was Monday night. Then Tuesday, I guess she wasn't feeling well Tuesday night. She went to South County Hospital, was checked out, came back home Wednesday. So meanwhile, I had gotten this book. It's called Mozart's Starling. And where did I find it? Right, is Mary Fulton? There she is. Right, I found it right there. And it's my habit, it's my addiction to buy books. And so the goal was that I was going to lend, I have thousands to read, so I was going to lend it to SJ, and she could lend it to anyone else, and I could get it back and hopefully get to read it over the summer. So it turns out she didn't end up lending it to people. It just didn't happen. But here's the note in the book. Mozart's Starling belongs to Adria Evans. It's a loaner copy from SJ. I'll return it to her later. XXXX. SJ. This is right, so SJ, for those of you who've read her books, saw nameplates and lending. And so the day, I guess, so she died again Wednesday night, Thursday. So that Wednesday afternoon, some of us had a meeting here. And is Barbara Beckwith here? I don't see her. So she was going to SJ's house. I called SJ that afternoon and she told me about the hospitalization. She was just tired. But Barbara went and picked up the book and the article for me. And then we found out that SJ died. So I guess what is my spiritual reflection? It is that you never know, that life is intertwined with death, that you will see a leaf for SJ that I think the words I'm going to use are similar to what she and I spoke of, and that this was such a community event of this book sharing and the anti-racism meeting, and how once again, especially after reading SJ's obituary, which is in the Providence Journal, May 12th. If you have not read it, please do. This is the tiniest piece of her long, long life.
So the idea goes back millennia. Augustine, who was a church father way back in the 4th century, believed no one is free from sin, not even an infant whose span of earthly life is but a single day. He was the architect of the Nicene Creed, which is still recited in different forms today in Christian churches. And 1,200 years later, at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the Heidelberg Catechism taught that humans are totally unable to do any good and inclined to all evil. Kind of wild, isn't it, considering that was the same period as the hymn we just sang. That was all about freedom and clarity of light, right? Now, a bit later, English writer Thomas Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, which probably a lot of you have read, articulated a philosophy that became the foundation of understanding for governments across the globe, and even justification for colonialism. He believed that humans are depraved, incapable of resisting sin, and the only way that we can be saved from our wicked nature is through civil society and its control. Now, that became justification for taking over the lands of the barbarians, right? They needed us to make them less wicked. Now the idea that government could curb evil might sound good in light of things like mass shootings and the argument for gun control, right? But it doesn't sound so good when you consider how relatively few angry men, mostly white men in government, are stripping people of reproductive freedom and access to medical care based on their really narrow view of what God wants for us. And I'm not even going to get into Machiavelli, because that's a whole bunch of terror we can save for another day. Now, given all this history with thinking about the nature of evil and how poorly things keep turning out, it's not surprising that in the modern world, people tend to believe that humans are basically evil, depraved, and that without the rules, regulations, and norms of polite society, whatever you think polite society looks like, we would all devolve very quickly into the ruthless beasts that we were born to be, right? And some scientists have done whatever they can to prove that idea. The most famous scientific experiments in history really seemed to succeed. At Stanford University in the 1970s, Professor Philip Zimbardo enlisted 24 young men to play the roles of inmates and guards in a makeshift basement prison in a campus building. People are nodding their heads. You remember this, right? Now, all of these young men describe themselves using nouns like hippie and peacenik, and adjectives like mellow and accepting. As it was reported in the press, on the second day of the 2-week experiment, the men assigned the role of prisoners staged a coup, and the men assigned the role of guards fought back with intensity and violence, which increased as the days went by. So ethicists and parents who found out what was going on got the experiment shut down after only the 6th day. Professor Zimbardo claimed that while the methodology may have been flawed, it proved, as far as he was concerned, that the prison environment was so toxic and so ruthless that it would turn any correctional officer into a sadist, even when they started off as sweet hippie kids. Rutger Bregman, in his new book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, writes about a researcher who went back into the archives and found out how Zimbardo actually coerced everyone to act the way he wanted them to act in order to create the outcome that he wanted. He went into this experiment wanting to prove that prisons were that powerful in bringing out our basest instincts. The thing is that he was more of a theatrical director than he was a scientific research. He knew how to get these kids to do what he wanted. Now, the Stanford prison experiment should not be confused with Professor Stanley Milgram's experiment at Yale, which actually happened 10 years earlier. You probably know this one too. In that experiment, paid participants were directed to give increasingly dangerous levels of electric shocks to people that they were told were prisoners convicted of terrible crimes. And you know this experiment, right? Regular folks were put in front of this big, scary-looking control panel and told that the person in the adjoining room was evil and had to be punished. But there was no electricity, and the prisoners were actually actors feigning these responses to this increasingly hideous torture. And Milgram reported that the paid participants willingly subjected other human beings to what they thought were lethal shocks, even as they listened to the tortured screams in the next room. And he said that his experiment proved that humans behave sadistically with just a bit of direction from authority. In Humankind, our author Bregman points out that the results of Stanley Milgram's shock experiments were published on the heels of another publication that shook the world at the same time. It was 1963, and Hannah Arendt had just published her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. It was about the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi convicted as the chief architect of the Holocaust. And parts of her book were reprinted in the New Yorker magazine that spring, and everyone was talking about it. Arendt called Eichmann shockingly normal and concluded her piece using the much repeated phrase, the banality of evil, a phrase that became the subtitle of her book. The way the press covered and people talked about these two simultaneous reports about Milgram's experiment and Eichmann, the two seem to prove that ordinary people are capable of, and even prone to, committing atrocious acts of violence and inhumanity against other humans. They seem to prove Augustine, Hobbes, and the Heidelberg Catechism to be correct. But according to Bregman, the parts of Milgram's experiment that didn't get published really proved something different. Milgram's experiment demonstrated that people just wanted to be helpful. In reality, it took a lot of prodding and even threatening to get people to be hurtful. Most of the participants, in fact 56% of them, said immediately afterward that they never believed the premise of the experiment. They knew walking in that no experiment, at Yale no less, could or would hurt people physically. They knew that it was unethical, illegal, immoral, and that it wouldn't happen. So when they were told to up the amperage, they did. Even as they listened to the intensified screams in the next room, which they didn't believe, they did what they were told because they knew that nobody was getting hurt. And those who took the bait and believed that they would actually be administering lethal amounts of electricity, they all walked out. Every single one of them, to a person. And that's the thing that never got published in the press, right? They walked out. They disobeyed the order and left, even under threat of having their stipend withheld. The stipend didn't matter to them. They weren't going to hurt other people. So here's the amazing part. The folks who thought it was a big act, like that none of this was real, they said afterward that they were just trying to be helpful. They thought, I don't get the point of this, but what do I know? I'm just some schlep off the street. I don't want to skew the results, so I'll just do what they tell me to do. They wanted to be helpful. And the same was true with Zimbardo's claim in that fake prison setup at Stanford. Interviews after the fact showed that all of the guys involved did just what Zimbardo wanted. They all had been told in advance that they'd have time to study during the experiment, but, Zimbardo and his whole theatrics didn't give them time to study. What he wanted to do was make them so exhausted that they would go along with whatever they did. So he kept pushing them and wouldn't let them sleep and give them time to study. And they just got fed up. They were worried about their finals. They were tired. They just wanted the whole thing to be over with. And the thing is that everyone involved felt the same way, including the one guy who faked a breakdown, screaming and yelling, saying he couldn't take it anymore, that he was losing his mind. He just wanted to pass his exams. And all of the other participants knew that. They're like, this is BS. We just want out of here. The thing is that they all went into the experiment just wanting to be helpful and make a little cash in the process. And they just played along to be helpful. And when it all started going south, they just wanted it over with. So it turns out that these sweet, hippie kids who were mellow, they weren't sadistic or stupid. Now, fortunately, the vast majority of us will never know what it was like for the subjects in Milgram and Zimbardo's experiments. That kind of thing is never allowed to happen anymore, so, it rarely does. But I think most of us would react the way those subjects did because we want to be helpful. I've found that people generally, almost universally, want to be helpful. Given a chance, that's what everybody wants. Even in a world where all of those other people seem like they're slaves to authority, ready to unthinkingly perpetrate evil to support despots they believe in, most of us see ourselves as good. We see ourselves as helpful. And the sad part is that fishers know this. Now, I don't mean fishermen who harvest seafood. I mean fishers with a PH, not an F. People who are trying to use technology to scam unsuspecting would-be helpers. It sounds nuts, but fishers learn from Milgram and Zimbardo. They're cagey. They contact you, always by text, email, or social media so that you can't see them. They impersonate someone you love or trust, like a grandchild or a minister, and they ask for your help, often for other people in an emergency. Now, they never cross the line into making demands because they know that people will resist that kind of aggression, especially from someone they trust, like a minister or a grandchild. So fishers make suggestions. They're appeals for compassionate assistance, right? And it starts with, this is how you can be helpful. And it quickly escalates to, the lives of these people depend on your immediate action. They get you scared. Helpful and scared, which is a pretty potent combination. So unfortunately, it's happened here, right? Fishers have gotten a few very generous, kind-hearted folks to buy gift cards to help fellow congregants. Because people want to be helpful, right? It's perfectly normal. The thing that I've been grateful for is that when the Fishers have given instructions to text or email the card numbers and authentication codes, which really feels unnecessarily complicated when you think about it, people in our congregation have disobeyed. Isn't that great? They think, oh, well, that's odd, or more likely, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'll just bring the cards with me to the service on Sunday. And you I know from experience, are not people who blindly follow directions. I'm looking at Anna, and she's like, thank God, ain't that the truth? We don't always do what we're told. In fact, we question everything. Even when we want to be helpful, we ask questions. Especially when we want to be helpful, we ask questions. That's our culture. But Adolf Eichmann was part of a very different culture. His was a culture where orders were vague, and the people below Hitler, which of course was everyone, engaged in what they call working toward the Führer. They were competing against each other for Hitler's respect and attention, and they all thought they were doing good. Doing the right thing for the betterment of the fatherland and the world. They really believed that. They really believed that they were on the right side of history, and that in the future they would be appreciated as heroes. Of course, right now, the extreme right all over the world think that they're on the correct side of history, and that they're protecting their sovereignty and security of their homelands, which can only be saved by the authoritarians to whom they've given so much power. When Hannah Arendt talked about how Eichmann didn't think about what he was being ordered to do, she wasn't saying that he was robotic. She wasn't saying that he was a mindless desk killer. She wasn't saying that he was incapable of thinking. As the mastermind behind a horrifyingly complex and sinister scheme, clearly, Eichmann was capable of thinking. What Arendt was saying was that he didn't think critically or compassionately. Like so many others, he took information at face value, especially when it seemed to serve his needs. And everyone does it. And that lack of critical thinking, that easily putting aside critical thought in order to support something that was good for him, that's what she said was perfectly shockingly normal. Because we all do it. The thing is that Eichmann didn't feel like a mass murderer. He felt like a good citizen doing the right thing for his country because that's what the Führer and his friends and his family and his neighbors told him needed to be done. So Hannah Arendt didn't agree with Augustine and Hobbes. She believed we're decent. But she also believed that when we go astray, when we take that easy path to self-service, we hide behind lies and cliches to justify ourselves, to varying degrees. We stop thinking critically and compassionately. And we do it all the time in different ways and at different scales. And that's the banality. We can be complicit in systems of evil without ever questioning it. But, as Bregman points out, the good news is that really what we want is to be helpful. And the proof is everywhere. When people are in danger, we don't ask their political affiliation, we just help. When neighbors are in need of food or money, we give what we can. We show up here on Sundays and share information about our friends and family, people struggling and needing accompaniment. And then we show up to provide that accompaniment. And when Fishers send us email trying to scam us, we have to think about it really hard because the appeal of helping a congregant with cancer is strong. So somebody else who wanted to be helpful all the time? SJ. SJ would help family and friends, her community and her congregation. She gave of her time and skill to further justice causes, especially accompanying indigenous communities as a liaison and an ally. And SJ was no pushover. She could smell a scam a mile away, that one. She was a 7th generation UU who exuded the most common characteristic of our culture. She was a critical and compassionate thinker who asked questions. She asked questions all the time. So the next time somebody claiming to be me asks you to do something, ask them a question. Ask something like, can you tell me more about that thing that you said last Sunday? Or, I can't remember the name of Marge's husband. What's her name? What's his name? Ask a question that no fisher could ever answer, just to get them off your back, because they'll know that you're onto them. And I really want you to just remember this. Nobody that you love or trust will ever contact you by text or an email and ask you to send them a gift card. So I'm going to say that again, because I can't say it enough. Nobody you love or trust will ever contact you by text or an email and ask you for a gift card. And if it seems like somebody you love or trust is doing just that, do what we do best. Ask questions. Ask questions that no fake could answer. Pick up the phone and call the person they're claiming to be. So one thing that we here at UUCSC will ask you to do, though, is help. We'll ask you to help in a lot of different ways, but we will always ask you to your face. We will always ask you to your face with a smile on our faces. Because the help of you is what makes this congregation, this little civil society, what it is. You know what I love most about the way that you all show up and give without the threat of hell? Every time you give money to support the congregation, every time you do something for one another, every time you show up for the persecuted or to bear witness to suffering anywhere in the world, every time you do something that gets remembered on that tree of life, you prove Augustine wrong. You prove Thomas Hobbes and the Heidelberg Catechism wrong. You prove that what is shockingly normal is to think critically and compassionately and to help. So thank you. So let's rise now as each of us is willing and able to sing together hymn number 331 in the great hymnal, Life is the Greatest Gift of All.